gentlemen, very warm welcome again to the Rifleman Museum. Tonight we're going to hear about a rifleman who went from being a rifleman in the 95th to being a Major General commanding the Ulster Division at the Somme. Nick Perry is going to talk about it. Nick and I actually go back somewhere where he was in the Northern Ireland office, I was in the army, in the back of the room during the Good Friday Agreement negotiations, all the rest of it. So I actually know him quite well, and we've had a good hour just reminiscing, haven't we? But today he's going to do his other hat, which is a historian, and he's going to talk to us about General Nugent.
James, thank you very much. Thank you. Everyone, thank you very much indeed. Just to check, I just press it.
Just press it once.
Oh, splendid. Thank you very much. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here back in Winchester. It's a long time since I've been here. The museum is tremendous. I know moving into a new phase of its existence. So thank you very much for the privilege of being here this evening. My topic this evening, as we've been hearing, is this man, Major General Oliver Nugent, who commanded the 36th Ulster Division on the Western Front from 1915 to 1918. But his particular relevance this evening, of course, is that he was also a 60th Rifles officer and was deeply proud of that fact. The 60th was the title he always used rather than the King's Royal Rifle Corps. So if that's one I'll use this evening, if I may. He spent 27 years from 1883 to 1910 on almost continuous service with the regiment. He served in 3 of its 4 regular battalions as subaltern, company commander, Battalion 2 IC, and commanding officer, and campaigned with it in Africa and India. His son followed him into the regiment in 1919. It provided Nugent's formative military experiences and shaped his attitude to command, not least the demanding standards he set for himself and his subordinates. And it gave him a network of contacts and patrons, which at 2 crucial stages helped his career. When putting this talk together, I was reminded of another distinguished Green Jacket officer, General Sir Nick Parker, with whom I had the good fortune to work when he was GOC in Northern Ireland in the early 2000s. And you might wonder what could connect 2 officers from such different eras. Well, there are parallels. At the most superficial level, General Nick's headquarters in Lisbon were in Thiepval Barracks, named after Nugent's most famous battle. And the GOC's residence there, Nugent House, is named after him. Both commanded battalions of the regiment. Both went on to command brigades and divisions on operations, though General Nick, of course, rose to much greater things as Commander-in-Chief, Land Forces and beyond. In the Irish context, both exercised command under close political and media scrutiny. Both were Staff College trained, but here there is a bit of a difference. Oliver Nugent was an intelligent man, but he would have struggled to keep up intellectually with General Nick, and in that regard, he's in exactly the same position as the rest of us. But in making that mental comparison, it struck me that Nugent is a more modern figure and his experience more relevant to us today than we might at first expect. So with a slight leap of imagination, what if Oliver Nugent suddenly appeared now this evening and joined this conversation? In what ways could he contribute to the discussion? And I think he might do so under 3 broad headings. First, he could tell us about his operational experience, which spanned the full spectrum from high-intensity operations on the Western Front to limited campaigns on the Northwest frontier to internal security operations in India and, albeit as observer rather than participant, to counterinsurgency in Ireland. Some of that experience has quite a contemporary feel. Second, he could talk about the challenges of exercising command in a politicized environment and having to manage political and media pressures as an operational commander. And third, he could tell us something of what I call the inner workings, and specifically some of the battlefield realities of regimental history. He was someone who believed in learning lessons from honest assessments of how operations had played out, the things that went well and not so well, the praiseworthy and the unpalatable. And that links into some recent developments in the use of regimental history, which I'll touch on at the end. So if I may, I'll start with a brief overview of his career to provide some context and then look in more detail at each of the 3 themes I've just mentioned. Nugent was born in November 1860, the son of an army officer, into a landed family in South County Cavan on the edge of Ulster. The family estate, Farron Connell, wasn't huge, a couple of thousand acres, and the Nugents, though a distinguished county family, weren't rich. Their roots in the Irish Midlands went back to the 12th century, and though personally a Unionist and a committed Anglican, Nugent regarded himself very much as Irish. He was educated at Harrow, which he disliked so much he sent his own son to Eton. And he was initially commissioned in 1882 into the 2nd Royal Munster Fusiliers, then based in Malta. He always intended to transfer to a more prestigious regiment when a vacancy occurred, but he was unwise enough to let this be known, which needless to say went down like a lead balloon with his fellow subalterns in the Munsters. So he spent a pretty miserable 9 months in Malta before, in June 1883, joining the 1st Battalion of the 60th Rifles in the Royal Barracks in Dublin. And the Royal Barracks, now Collins Barracks, is today part of the National Museum of Ireland and houses an excellent military exhibition. And with his new battalion, for the 2nd time in a year, he got off on the wrong foot by alienating his brother officers. The fact is that the young Nugent was a rather brash, gauche young man, alternating between overconfidence and insecurity. This time, though, he was wise enough to listen to advice and adjusted his behavior before things got out of hand. But were he here, he could at least advise us on what not to do as a young officer joining a new regiment. A second problem was more serious. The fact was that he wasn't wealthy enough to survive comfortably in an expensive regiment on a home posting. His allowance from his father was insufficient. The estate, it was discovered on his father's death in 1884, was seriously in debt, soon made worse by a rent strike by the Nugent's tenants, part of the Irish Land War. And the situation was exacerbated by Nugent's own extravagance, buying expensive outfits, losing money nightly at cards, and trying to keep up with officers richer than himself. By early 1886, matters had reached crisis point, and he concluded desperately that he would have both to resign his commission and sell Farron Connell. But at the last minute, he changed his mind, one of the turning points in his life, and decided instead to transfer to the 4th Battalion in India to try to save money. In September 1886, he left Ireland. It is one of the paradoxes of Nugent's career that to preserve the home he loved, he spent most of his life away from it. Between 1882 and 1920, when he retired from the army, he spent only 5 years in Ireland. And he drew this jokey little cartoon, probably in 1892, on his way back to India from Ireland after leave, showing him at the railway station. And at the bottom were the words, "Oceans of Tears." Nevertheless, his decision to go to India worked. It saved the estate financially, and it was the making of his career. The 4th Battalion had been in India for 10 years and was a pretty hard-bitten outfit. But the 4 years Nugent spent with it were invaluable because during that time, he grew up. He started taking his profession seriously, had a spell as acting company commander, took part in large-scale maneuvers, and held various junior staff appointments. And when the 1st Battalion arrived in India in 1891, and Nugent transferred back to it, officers he'd served with before were amazed by the change in him. With the 1st Battalion in the 1890s, Nugent served on the northwest frontier and earned the DSO, and we'll come back to that in a moment. He secured a place in the Staff College in 1897, helped by the influence of another 60th Rifles officer, Sir Edvers Buller, then the Adjutant General, one of the occasions when regimental patronage assisted his career. In 1899, he married, and in October 1899, he was badly wounded at Talana Hill, the opening battle of the South African War, and remained a Boer prisoner for 9 months. He went on to be 2IC of the 3rd Battalion in Bermuda, and then from 1906 to 1910, commanding officer of the 4th Battalion, first in the UK, and then back in India. From 1911 to 14, he commanded a territorial infantry brigade before returning to Ireland on half pay. There, he got caught up in the growing Home Rule crisis and controversially took command of the Ulster Volunteer Force in Cavan, despite still being a serving officer. He felt obliged to try to protect local Protestants in the event of a civil war, and he stressed that under no circumstances would he lead the Cavan Volunteers in a confrontation with the police or army. But this wasn't an episode with which, in retrospect, he was comfortable. We'll come to the detail of his First World War career in a second. But just to summarize it briefly, With the outbreak of war in August 1914, he was sent to command the Hull defences in the north of England. In the summer of 1915, he took command of assumed command of a brigade of the 14th Division in the Ypres salient. In September 1915, he took command of the Ulster Division and would lead it in its 5 biggest battles: the Somme in 1916, Messines, 3rd Ypres and Cambrai in 1917, and the German Spring Offensive in 1918. In May 1918, he was replaced by a younger officer and sent to India. He retired from the army in 1920 and returned to Cavan, where he died in 1926, aged 65. And just to say a word about Nugent's personality. On the left, there's another view of William Connor's fine portrait of him, now in the City Hall in Belfast. And I think it brings out well Nugent's intelligence. He was an intelligent man. But it also shows a rather benign, mild-looking general. But if you were one of his subordinates, it was the face on the right you saw. Nugent was a tough, uncompromising commander. He had a strong personality, decisive and intimidating. He was professionally capable, setting high standards which he expected to be met, and he didn't suffer fools. But he also didn't suffer some people who definitely weren't fools, including James Craig, the Ulster Unionist leader, which didn't help political relations. He had an explosive temper, exacerbated by the wounds he'd sustained in South Africa. But there's no doubt of his concern for the well-being of his soldiers, nor of his belief that thorough planning, training, and discipline were the key to keeping as many of them alive in action as possible. So that's Nugent's background, which at first glance appears to be that of a fairly typical late Edwardian Victorian officer. But that appearance is a little deceptive. So if Nugent did walk through the door now, what could he tell us about those 3 broad areas of operational command, political management, and battlefield realities? Well, beginning then with his operational experience and starting at the lower limited war end of the spectrum. When, back in the 1990s, I first read Nugent's diaries, his experiences on the northwest frontier seemed not only dated, but even rather quaint. They don't feel that way now. Of course, no one 25 years ago expected the British Army, including the Rifles, to be back in that region in the 21st century. Between 1891 and 1895, Nugent took part in 3 campaigns against Pashtun tribes on the Indian-Afghan border. And the largest and most important was in April 1895, the campaign to relieve the besieged fort at Chitral. As part of this, the British main force, which included the 1st Battalion, had to fight its way through the Malacan Pass. This proved a much harder task than expected, and in the end involved a full-scale divisional attack, 3 brigades supported by artillery, opposed by 12,000 tribesmen. These may have been small wars, but they were serious engagements. The battalion was tasked to capture part of the ridge overlooking the pass. Nugent commanded a company in the 2nd wave, but seeing the attack in danger of stalling, he spotted a spur leading to the top, took his company at speed up it, and stormed over the crest, where they were hit by a blast of close-range fire and suffered several casualties. Nugent rescued a wounded man lying in the open despite being hit in the leg by a ricochet, and then continued the advance. The tribesmen abandoned the position, and he was subsequently awarded the DSO for his performance. And the Malakand and the Swat Valley beyond it have remained fierce centers of tribal resistance, as the modern Pakistan army knows to its cost. Hundreds of tribesmen from the area crossed the mountains to join the Taliban, fighting NATO forces in Afghanistan. The 1895 campaign established Nugent's reputation, of course, and boosted his career. But he also learned some wider lessons from the campaign, and one of them was seeing at first hand the problems that result in the chain of command when one of the links is weak. In this case, a capable force commander, Sir Robert Lowe, and a good battalion CO, Colonel McCrum, but a brigadier out of his depth. And the brigadier in this case was Nugent's former CO in the 4th Battalion, Alexander Kinloch, whom Nugent hadn't much liked. Kinloch was a famous big game hunter, but he was struggling in his new role. And rather than remove him, Lowe got round the problem by sidelining Kinloch's brigade for the rest of the campaign, to Nugent's frustration. And part of the reason there, I think, was the difficult politics of an Indian Army general relieving a senior British Army officer mid-campaign. So Nugent, were he here, could certainly discuss with the Afghan veterans the similarities and differences between their two campaigns. He could talk about leading soldiers under fire and using his initiative to achieve the commander's aim. And he might also discuss whether the Kinloch episode influenced his own approach as a divisional commander, where he was quick to relieve subordinates he suspected weren't up to the job, even if sometimes those judgments could be harsh. Jumping forward more than 20 years then to 1919 brings us on to internal security and aid to the civil power. In 1919, the year of the Amritsar massacre, Nugent commanded the Meerut district in northern India. The British faced the most widespread and serious disturbances since the Indian Mutiny. Indeed, they weren't sure whether they were facing public disorder or outright insurrection. And that failure to understand the nature of the problem they were dealing with contributed to General Dyer's disastrous decisions at Amritsar in April. Although the disorder was centered mainly in the Punjab, it spilled over into Nugent's district in the neighboring United Provinces. His area contained only one city, the Indian capital, Delhi, comparable in size to, for example, Basra in 2006. But he also had several other large urban areas, including Meerut, where he had to provide military support to the police. And his manpower was just as stretched as was that of the British Army during that difficult period in southern Iraq in 2006-07. So, were he here, I think he could speak quite interestingly about how he and the provincial governor, Sir Harcourt Butler, decided where to position those troops they had in the areas of greatest vulnerability, and how Nugent developed his program of flag marches, as they were called, moving units around rapidly through areas of potential trouble to bolster the police and give the impression the British had more forces available than they did. Luckily for him, the situation in his area was never as bad as it was in the Punjab, and the bluff worked. But even so, his troops and the police in Delhi did open fire during one riot, killing 10 civilians. And the brigadier in charge, though not Nugent himself, was summoned to appear before the Hunter Commission, the public inquiry that followed into the events of 1919. Public scrutiny of military decision-making after the event isn't an invention of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. A counterinsurgency campaign he wasn't involved as a commander, but nevertheless experienced firsthand, was the Irish War of Independence. Nugent retired from the army in the summer of 1920 and arrived back in Ireland just as the levels of violence were rising dramatically. He undoubtedly regarded the British government's hardline, not to say unprincipled, security policy in Ireland, particularly between the summer of 1920 and the summer of 1921, as wholly counterproductive. He saw for himself the gradual erosion of discipline and morale in the Royal Irish Constabulary in the face of heavy casualties and intimidation. He strongly disapproved of the frequently heavy-handed and sometimes criminal behavior of the auxiliaries in black and tans, the paramilitary police reinforcements brought in to support the RIC. At one stage, he even intervened to rescue a local youth who'd been seized by the black and tans, which may explain why, though the IRA raided Farron Connell for arms and commandeered his car, the house wasn't burnt, as so many others were. So if he were here, Nugent could say something about the importance of ensuring high standards of discipline and leadership in counterinsurgency operations, and particularly in a quasi-civil war situation like the Troubles, where a significant part of the security forces were locally recruited and were therefore subject to external pressures and especially vulnerable to attack. And he could perhaps discuss some of that with those who've served in Northern Ireland. And turning to the high-intensity end of the operational spectrum, just 3.5 years ago, the thought of a major conventional war in Europe seemed inconceivable. Yet now, Nugent's Great War experience has striking similarities with what's happening in Ukraine, with its massive artillery bombardments and waves of infantry attacks. Those tactics would certainly be familiar to him. But so too would be the concept of using high-tech weapon systems alongside brute force, even if the details of drone strikes and cyber warfare might be a bit beyond him. Because a defining characteristic of Nugent's career was the extraordinary degree of technological change he experienced. In March 1883, soon after joining the Munster Fusiliers in Malta, he carried the regimental colours on an exercise when the battalion, still in their red tunics, practiced changing formation to repel cavalry. 35 years later, almost to the day, in March 1918, he was fighting a battle involving tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, heavy artillery, and machine guns, but still amazingly horsed cavalry also. This wasn't just warfare with new weapons, it was warfare literally in a new dimension, the air, and using entirely new substances like phosgene gas. And much of that change was, of course, crammed into a 4-year period between 1914 and 1918. Nugent had his first experience of chemical attack in the Ypres salient in June 1915. In May 1916, he was, I believe, the first British divisional commander to conduct an aerial reconnaissance of enemy positions. Early in 1917, he oversaw the introduction into the division of the new platoon tactics, platoon-based infantry tactics, precursor to those still in use today. And in late 1917 at Cambrai, he took part in a combined arms offensive involving massed armor, predicted artillery fire, and close air support that would have been familiar to a Second World War commander. And to take just one example of the pace of change, in April 1915, the British were attacked with poison gas for the first time. Within 5 months, they had devised and issued to their frontline units their own defensive equipment, trialed and brought into mass production chemical weapons of their own, developed means of delivering them and an operational concept for their use, transported them to France and deployed them in action at Loos in September 1915, all in the space of less than 21 weeks. This was development at a speed to match that of the COVID vaccines, and Nugent and his colleagues had to adapt very quickly. Were he here today, he could discuss how he coped with the pace of change. But alongside the technology, there needed to be changes in command culture, which in some ways was even more challenging. And that's illustrated by 2 significant episodes for Nugent in 1915 and 1916, both of which have a 60th Rifles link. The first was in July 1915, when Nugent was commanding 41 Brigade, part of the new Army 14th Division in the Ypres salient. His brigade contained 2 battalions of the 60th Rifles, the 7th and 8th, and 2 of the Rifle Brigade, also the 7th and 8th, so it was very much a green jacket formation. They'd been in the salient since early June and were still learning the ropes in a difficult sector. Nugent, however, had already earned a reputation as an aggressive commander, his battalions constantly harrying the enemy. But at the end of July 1915, disaster struck in a major operational setback that nearly ended his career. On the 19th of July, the regular 3rd Division had blown a huge mine under the German positions at Hooge, east of Ypres, and occupied the crater. 3 days later, Nugent's brigade took over the newly captured position, and for the next week were hammered by German artillery. Then, in the early hours of the 30th of July, and under cover of an intense bombardment, the Germans launched a major attack using flamethrowers, the first time they'd been employed against the British. The 2 battalions in the front line suffered heavy losses, and the shock survivors were forced back to their support lines. Nugent went up at once to see the situation for himself and reported that it would take a full divisional attack to retake the position. However, the corps commander, Sir John Keir, insisted on 41 Brigade mounting a daylight counterattack that same afternoon with very weak artillery support. Nugent twice protested that this could not succeed, but was overruled. The assault duly went in on the afternoon of the 30th of July, and the leading waves were mown down by unsuppressed machine guns, at which point Nugent called off the attack. In all, 41 Brigade lost over 1,200 men at the crater, and the 9th Battalion of the 60th, which was also involved in the attack, lost another 350. And Lieutenant Sidney Woodruff of the Rifle Brigade won a posthumous VC. Nugent was devastated by the losses and extremely bitter that he'd been forced to mount the attack. At least one commentator has since suggested that he should have refused to obey the order. That thought, I think, never crossed his mind. Having twice registered his objections as the man on the spot, he regarded it as his duty to carry out his orders. Were he here, we might ask him about the possibility of disobeying, but I suspect he might not even understand the question. The search for scapegoats began immediately. As Nugent's men came out of the line, they were jeered by regular troops, and there was scathing criticism of the 14th Division by other senior officers. So there wasn't much support or sympathy there for a new army formation trying to find its feet. Nugent knew his career was on the line. He could rely on his divisional commander, General Cooper, who was already fending off hostile questions from Corps headquarters. But he also took care to write to two influential contacts, setting out his version of events. The first was Archie Murray, Deputy CIGS at the War Office, a close friend from Staff College. Murray showed the letter to Lord Kitchener, and replied encouragingly that he hoped Nugent's prospects wouldn't be damaged. The second contact was Sir Edward Hutton, a senior 60th Rifles officer, who immediately forwarded Nugent's account to the King with a supportive covering letter, and who almost certainly lobbied elsewhere on his behalf. Their efforts worked in that Nugent, unlike a whole string of brigadiers before him, wasn't sacked. But the surprising thing about the toxic command culture in Second Army at this time, of bullying, scapegoating, and wastefulness with men's lives, is that it occurred under the leadership of the officer most of us regard as the best British general on the Western Front, Herbert Plumer. Indeed, Nugent enormously admired Plumer, under whom the Ulster Division achieved its greatest success at Messines in June 1917. But at this stage, Plumer was too recently in post to change the way his army functioned, and Hooge was just one of 4 badly executed Second Army operations in this period that between them cost over 20,000 casualties. It was Marshal Foch, I think, who said that it takes 16,000 dead to train a major general. Even Plumer needed time to learn. The second example is Nugent's and the Ulster Division's most famous battle, the attack on the Schwaben Redoubt on the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Somme. It was one of the defining experiences of the Ulster Protestant Unionist tradition in the 20th century, and remains of central importance to that identity today. And the performance itself was no myth. It was a genuinely impressive military achievement. We needn't go into the detail of the battle this evening, but just to outline briefly what happened. On the 1st of July, the division overran 5 lines of trenches, captured the formidable Schwaben Redoubt on top of the Thiepval Ridge, and held on, attacked from 3 sides for 15 hours without reinforcement, before being forced back to a foothold in the German front line. It suffered over 5,000 casualties, including around 2,000 dead, and won 4 Victoria Crosses, 3 of them posthumous. Nugent's contribution was his thorough preparation beforehand, including sending his leading waves into no man's land before the British barrage lifted, so that they could rush the trenches before the enemy machine gunners could get in position. Yet, once his troops went over the top, like all great war generals, he could do little in the absence of portable radios to influence events. As has rightly been said, armies in the First World War could kill better than they could communicate. Uniquely on the 1st of July, the Ulster Division had 3 command levels above it, all filled by officers from the same regiment, the 60th Rifles. Nugent, of course, commanding the division, Thomas Morland, the commander of 10 Corps, and Henry Rawlinson, commander of 4th Army. All 3 had joined the regiment within 14 months of each other in 1883-4. But even though they knew each other, the difficulties these officers encountered in planning this major operation demonstrates how much the British Army still had to learn. Back in April 1916, Douglas Haig had rejected Rawlinson's initial plan for the Somme as insufficiently ambitious. So Rawlinson revised it, both to widen the attack frontage and increase the depth of the objectives. But he did so without increasing the artillery available to support it. And this dilution of the artillery led directly to the disaster of the 1st of July. The Thiepval Ridge was recognized as a very tough position, but when Morland requested that his depth objectives be adjusted to reflect that, or that he at least be allowed to pause to reorganize before attacking them, Rawlinson refused. At the next level down, Nugent wanted to outflank the Schwaben Redoubt from the north rather than assault it frontally, using the terrain to provide a degree of protection from flanking machine guns. But late in the day, Morland overruled him on the grounds that this would leave a gap with the neighbouring division. And within the Ulster Division itself, Nugent made a controversial decision of his own. He refused to allow his battalion COs to accompany their units into the attack, because he wanted to preserve them for the later fighting. But the result was that on the ridge on the 1st of July, there was no officer above the rank of major to take overall command. So there were plenty of teething problems. The army group commander, Haig, imposed on the army commander, Rawlinson, a plan he didn't believe in. Rawlinson, in his turn, refused to modify that plan to take account of the particular problems facing Morland, attacking a key objective. Morland failed to provide his divisional commanders with sufficiently detailed guidance to enable them to produce mutually supporting plans of their own. And Nugent made a probably mistaken call about his own command arrangements that impacted on his brigadiers and infantry COs. And this was compounded during the attack when Morland, for understandable reasons, decided to use his reserves not to reinforce the Ulster Division's success, but to try to retrieve the failure on the flank. Had this operation been mounted in July 1918, it would have been done very differently. The Somme in 1916, like the Ypres salient in 1915, was a steep learning experience for commanders at every level, including officers as capable as these three. So Nugent, if here, could discuss how British planning processes not merely evolved, but were transformed in the 31 months he spent in France. And turning very briefly to Nugent's relationship with the politicians at home. The Ulster Division was a unique formation raised in large part from the Ulster Volunteer Force. Nugent was now the commander of the military component of a distinct political community, Ulster Unionism, whose leaders had a strong sense of ownership of the division and felt they had a right to a say in the running of it. And Nugent from the outset was equally determined that there would be no political interference in his command. At first, his relations with the Ulster Unionist leader, James Craig, were reasonably good, but they deteriorated quickly for three reasons. The first was the personnel changes Nugent made when he arrived with the division. When he took command in September 1915, he realized that it wasn't ready for operations and went through it like a dose of salts, replacing all three infantry brigadiers, both his senior staff officers and half his battalion COs. Several had been leading figures in the UVF, and some started briefing against him when they got home. The second reason was political, the future of Ireland. It was clear by mid-1916 that the Unionist leadership's objective after the war would be the partition of Ireland, with the 6 northeastern counties, today's Northern Ireland, splitting away from a Home Rule Dublin Parliament to remain within the United Kingdom. This meant leaving behind 3 Ulster counties, Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. Of course, Nugent's home was in Cavan, and many of his soldiers came from these 3 counties, and he regarded the Unionist decision as a betrayal. And the third reason was tension over recruiting, when Nugent believed, rightly, that the politicians weren't doing enough to address the division's chronic manpower problems. Matters came to a head in December 1916, when in a Christmas message in a Belfast newspaper, he sharply criticised Ulster's recruiting performance. Unionist politicians were outraged. There were calls in the press for Nugent's removal, and soon the story in Belfast was that it was Nugent's message that had caused the collapse of recruiting in Ulster, and not the other way round. Early in 1917, Craig made a determined effort through his government contacts to get Nugent removed, though he didn't succeed. So Nugent's attempt to apply political pressure through the media didn't work. And were he here, he could say something about the perils of attempting to play the politicians at their own game. And thirdly and finally, Nugent could tell us a good deal about, as I say, battlefield realities and the inner workings of regimental history, about both the good days and the not so good. So, not just about the extraordinary act of collective courage that captured the Schwaben redoubt, or the tactical skill that secured the ridge at Messines, but also Third Ypres, when the survivors of 2 brigades came streaming back in retreat, or the 8 days of desperate fighting during the March 1918 offensive, when the division came close to annihilation. He could also tell us what, in his view, made the difference between a good unit and a poor one, why there were some battalions in the division he trusted and some he didn't. Why, for example, he regarded his Inniskilling and Irish Fusiliers battalions and half his Royal Irish Rifles ones as very good. Why it was his Belfast units had such discipline problems in their early months at the front. And why it was that in December 1917, he recommended that the 14th Irish Rifles be disbanded as unreliable after more than 2 years under his command. Yet a few weeks later, he was fighting to save the 15th Irish Rifles from being broken up. because in 1916 he hadn't much rated either battalion. But over the next 18 months, one unit improved and the other didn't, despite measures like having a specially selected CO put in command. So he might have some observations on why particular traits or characteristics were so persistent in some units and so hard to shift. And connected to this, he could also speak about his management of his battalion COs, about 60 of whom served under him between October 1915 and May 1918. Of these, 17 became casualties. Of the rest, he got 7 promoted to brigadier, and he relieved 10 others of command for a variety of reasons. So he could talk about the strengths and weaknesses he perceived there, and the qualities he thought fitted people for command. Nugent, of course, had no illusions about what a brutal environment the battlefield is. With the 60th Rifles in the 1890s, for example, he'd seen some of the grimmer aspects of colonial warfare, such as the unnecessary and unsanctioned destruction of villages, or the sight of a wounded Afghan prisoner who'd been burned alive by Gurkha troops, or his own role supervising a firing squad that executed a villager for attacking a soldier. So he wasn't afraid, in a lecture to his officers and NCOs in 1915 as the division deployed to France, to raise difficult issues, such as the possibility of officers having to shoot their own men to prevent a rout. And when that happened, as it did in July 1916 and March 1918, he supported the actions taken. Frank Crozier, CEO of the 9th Irish Rifles in 1916, and a very strange man, describes one of these episodes in his memoir, A Brass Hat in No Man's Land. Nugent was also on occasion frustrated by the killing of prisoners by Ulster Division raiding parties. He knew it was difficult to prevent in the heat of battle, but he regarded it as not only a problem morally, but also as militarily inefficient, given the need for captives to question. And he was prepared to recommend the execution of 3 young soldiers in early 1916 for desertion, including James Crozier, whose grave is shown here, not because he was heartless. In fact, he was reluctant to use the death penalty, but because he felt military effectiveness required that the sentences be carried out. He also faced the challenge of managing the Ulster Division's unique sense of identity in a way that accorded with the Army's expectations. The entire regimental system, then as now, was based on the controlled recognition of regional and national distinctiveness. It was not, though, designed to cope with the kind of intense political fervour that had led to the formation of the UVF. And Nugent knew there was nervousness in the military hierarchy that so political a formation might prove disruptive. He had no difficulty with his men expressing their Ulster Protestant heritage, for example, by celebrating the 12th of July. Shown here is a scene from Frank McGuinness's play, Observe the Sons of Ulster marching towards the Somme. But there was a narrow line to be walked, even between allowing that expression of identity and remaining within boundaries the Army found acceptable. And because Nugent and his COs were so successful in merging the UVF sense of identity into wider regimental traditions and identification with the division, that it's easy to underestimate their achievement. So he could describe for us how he approached all of these behavioral and identity issues on the battlefield and off it. And switching focus for a moment as we draw towards the end, to look more broadly at the question of learning from operational experience. There have in recent years been a number of not regimental histories as such, but academic-based accounts of particular units in recent operations or new assessments of campaigns drawing on regimental accounts. And 4 outstanding examples are shown here. Ed Burke's superb An Army of Tribes, which examines the experience of 2 Scottish regiments in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s. Helen Parr's Our Boys, looking at 2 para in the Falklands in which her uncle was killed. Hugh Bennett's examination of the British Army in Northern Ireland in the early days of Op Banner, and Matthew Hughes' study of British policy in Palestine in the 1930s, which references a controversial reprisal involving the Royal Ulster Rifles, who were then commanded by an officer who had served under Nugent in 1918. All of them are excellent studies, balanced and perceptive. All of them bring out examples of courage and professionalism and restraint. And all of them raise some challenging issues around, for example, regimental tribalism, excessive force, alleged collusion, attitudes to civilians, including women, and official policies, which would be unacceptable today. And I'm a believer, speaking personally, that it's well worth our while as regimental communities to engage fully with reputable historians like these, even if we don't always agree with every conclusion they reach, because that way we get better, more balanced, more objective history. And I think Nugent would agree with that, though I accept he might not be entirely comfortable about publishing all the results. There's one final point of which Nugent could remind us, and that is the continuities, cultural and operational, that exist within military organizations, because the intergenerational chains within institutions are surprisingly short. It so happens that Nugent and Bernard Montgomery only just missed each other on the Western Front. In July 1917, after Messines, the Ulster Division transferred from Plumer's 2nd Army to Gough's 5th Army. And on the 5th of July, Nugent went to say goodbye to the staff at 9 Corps, with whom he had developed a close working relationship. Had he visited the following day instead, he might well have met newly promoted Captain Bernard Montgomery, who joined the 9 Corps staff on the 6th of July. And the wider point here is that for Montgomery, as for Nugent, serving under Plumer in 2nd Army was a highly formative experience, one which shaped Monty's approach in World War II in important ways, including his emphasis on training, meticulous planning, and the use of firepower to conserve men. The last head of the British Army to serve under Montgomery in Normandy, Gwyn Bramall, another Green Jacket general, of course, retired only in 1985. The head of the army, when my biography of Nugent was first published in 2020, Mark Carlton Smith, was commissioned in 1982. So just 3 overlapping careers span the period from 1908, when Montgomery was commissioned, till 2020, 112 years on. And so we shouldn't be surprised if Nugent, looking at the British Army today, would see much that is different, but also things he recognized, certainly in terms of culture and ethos, perhaps also to a degree in operational style. And leading on from that, in conclusion, there's a lot about Nugent's career, as I've said, that I believe is still relevant in terms of his operational experience, the politics of command, and the realities of war at regimental level. But were he here now, he might well flip the question round. And rather than us looking at him, he might look at us and be surprised to find what hasn't changed. A major war in Europe, violence in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, continuing political tensions in Northern Ireland, and ongoing conversations about the future constitutional configuration of the United Kingdom, and the structure, role, and recruitment of the British Army still being debated. History might not repeat itself, nor even rhyme, as Mark Twain put it, but it does leave strong echoes. If Oliver Nugent walked through that door now, I think we'd have plenty to talk about. And there I'll stop. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to ask a question, just stick your hand up and we'll pass this round, because it means we can record the question on the Zoom.
Nick, what about the idea of Alan Clark's idea of donkeys, lands led by donkeys? Sorry.
Yes. Well, excellent question, Jess. But I essentially don't agree with that analysis, as we've been discussing here. I think the whole First World War experience was a huge learning challenge for everybody, for every army, the French, the Germans, the British, obviously. I think there were particular periods when that description is more apt, and I think the summer of 1915 is a period where the culture of command had not caught up with the technological changes. But I really think from the period of late 1960 onwards through to the end of the war is a period of constant improvement and winnowing out of commanders who weren't up to the job, but also improvements of technique in technique. And the question is, I mean, Douglas Haig, obviously a controversial figure, presides over some disastrous moments on the Battle of the Somme, but then 100 Days Campaign in 1918, the greatest series of victories in the British Army's history. Is that because Haig improved as a general, or because the machine underneath him was developing its own procedures and its own internal knowledge? And I think it's probably a combination of the two. But I think in the case of Nugent, it was definitely a matter of a capable officer learning new techniques under extreme pressure, and learning on the job, of course, is a very costly experience, as we know. So I think Alan Clark's book is an interesting one. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who's wants the latest view on the development of operational command in the Great War.
I'd like to ask what you know about the fact that Nugent's attack in the Somme was successful because he'd taken this idea of bringing his troops forward,
Yes.
and why, if he'd done that, he hadn't asked his generals on either side to do the same, which would have not left his flanks exposed.
Well, that's an excellent point. The Ulster Division isn't the only one on the Somme front that did that. I mean, a couple of other places, the commanding generals put their leading waves into no man's land beforehand. I think that's probably a reflection of the failure of joined-up planning in 1916, in the sense that's a sort of good idea that should have been generated, I think, at Corps Command or at higher levels. It was the train, to be fair, helped on the Ulster Division's front because of the slope of the ground, and also on that particular sector, the German wire had been relatively well cut, so they had that opportunity which wasn't available to the 32nd Division beside it. And that's partly because they had a regiment of French artillery attached to the Ulster Division, which was used to and had the right fusing to destroy wire entanglements. But you're absolutely right. There's a good idea that should have been widely dispersed. And I think, to be fair, by 1917, it would have been. There would have been a system for good ideas or ideas that weren't being disseminated across the army.
It's not a question, but you mentioned the Gurkhas on the Northwest Frontier.
Yes.
At a recent presentation across the way, the next door there, the Gurkhas found fighting the Pathans a lot tougher than fighting the Japanese.
Right. Yeah.
And that gives you some idea of the battles that took place on those restaurants. They found them much tougher.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And some of us have done the same, and they are tough.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, thank you for that.
Can you say something about how the army is regarded in Ireland today? Because you're obviously, you're from there, and we had the Good Friday Agreement now 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Province has moved on. How does the British Army sit in Northern Ireland today?
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent question and a very tough one. As you know, I'm a regimental trustee of the Royal Irish Regiment, so I'm biased when I'm talking about this. Well, of course, it's changed in the sense that, and I should say, looking at the armed forces as a whole, and of course, the Navy and the Air Force have never had the same kind of difficult relationship with parts of the population in Northern Ireland. It's moderated massively in the last, since the Good Friday Agreement in terms of, and we are now, the Royal Irish Regiment, opening a museum in the centre of Belfast, and we're trying to attract, and we are attracting people from nationalist West Belfast to come and visit it. We don't spend much time there, or we won't spend too much time there talking about Op Banner, and we will need to deal with difficult issues like the Ulster Defence Regiment and Royal Irish Home Service and all of those difficult things, Bloody Sunday and so on. But the British Army's tradition is so deeply rooted in Ireland, and so many families from all backgrounds have family relations, that there's quite a lot of common ground there, and a good place to start is the First World War, because so many, particularly West Belfast Catholic families, joined the British Army. Some of them went on to join the IRA afterwards, but there is that is a common European experience that they experience through service in the British Army. So I think the historical experience is a way of mediating attitudes towards the modern army, and I think attitudes are of course, on the unionist side, there's huge enthusiasm for the army and always has been. But on the national side, the passage of time, attitudes are changing. Sinn Féin laying wreaths on Remembrance Day. Sinn Féin minister, I think, is due to visit our museum. That's a big thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. But I mean, so there's progress. There's an awful lot of history there, though, and it's unfinished business, the past, for us, as you know, and there's, in all sorts of ways. So there's some ground to cover still, but it's the start of a conversation, as I think the way the museum trustees would regard it, and the fact that people are engaging in it shows that progress is being made. But I think as a recruiting area, Northern Ireland is still quite a strong one for the British Army, as you know. And we had Armed Forces Day just last week in Newtonards. The red arrows flew over our house. Very exciting, marvelous.
Yeah, am I right in that Nugent was the only top commander who wasn't knighted at the end of the war?
He wasn't knighted in the, yes, all the other commanders at Messines pretty well. Divisional at Messines were united in January, got in the New Year's Honours List 1918. He was notably excluded, although his name he had been recommended on the same basis as, and that's because Douglas Haig blocked it. I have no doubt.
So
about that.
what was it between Haig and Nugent?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. They were at Staff College together in the 1890s, and they didn't like each other. Nugent,
I think that's
well, Nugent thought Haig was a colossal bore. I mean, that's the first thing. And they obviously had so something went badly wrong and stuff. But no, they didn't. He was. I don't think so. Well, they didn't coincide at school if they did. But no, so Staff College did the damage, and then initially their relationship in France seemed reasonably good, but then he had a dispute over the divisional title in 1917. Of course, conscription exists in Britain. It is not extended to Ireland. As a result, recruits are drying up for the Ulster Division and the 16th Irish Division in France. Nugent suggests through an intermediary that, Haig suggests through an intermediary that Nugent volunteered to drop the title Ulster from the division's title. And he refuses to volunteer it, partly because he thinks it would be a grave blow to morale, because it's a very important identifier. And as he said, even English soldiers serving with the division had come to identify strongly with it. So he refused it. But also, as he said, we have to return to live in Ireland or live in Ulster after the war, and this would be, make it impossible for us. And I think Haig resented him for that. So I can think of no other reason why. The only person, the corps commander, the army commander, both recommended him for a knighthood. It didn't go to London, so who else only Haig could have stopped it. It seems surprisingly, Haig had all sorts of issues about Haig, but pettiness isn't one that you would necessarily associate with him, but that was a petty thing to do. And so he doesn't get his knighthood until 1922 when Henry Wilson is CIGS, or as the president. And they knew each other, of course, before the war. So.